Welcome back to the Astro-Insights podcast. In episode 6, we explored the life and career of one of England's most famous and well-respected astrologers, William Lilly. This week, we're talking to Dr. Patrick Curry, author of Prophecy and Power, Astrology in Early Modern England, which explores astrology during the time of William Ashmole, an era that marked both the heyday of English astrology and its subsequent decline as the sweeping changes of the scientific revolution began reshaping society and culture. Patrick is a writer and scholar with a PhD in the history and philosophy of science from University College London, who has lectured on astrology and philosophy at both the University of Kent and the Sophia Centre in Bath. The editor-in-chief of the Ecological Citizen, Patrick is also the author of Defending Middle-earth, Tolkien, Myth and Modernity, Ecological Ethics, Enchantment, Wonder in Modern Life, and most recently, Art and Enchantment, How Wonder Works. Join us for a meandering but interesting discussion on Lilly, Ashmole, and the parallels between 17th century England and now, as well as the nature of astrology and the impact of modernity on both divination and the human experience. So welcome to episode 7 of the Astro Insights podcast. With me today is Dr. Patrick Curry. I should say sort of straight off the bat that Patrick and I know each other from the MA program in the cultural study of cosmology and divination at the University of Kent. But Patrick, himself has a long and varied career, which we're going to get into in the podcast. So welcome, Patrick.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be here.
So Patrick, yes, it's been a while, but I thought we could just sort of begin at the beginning and get a little bit into your background, how you got into astrology, where things kind of took you from there, and see where the conversation takes us.
Sure. Well, I grew up in the Canadian Midwest in Winnipeg in the 1950s. I was born in 1951. And my older sister was an astrologer. So I kind of absorbed it when in the course of growing up as a teenager, for example, probably mostly as a teenager. And the astrology that I absorbed, and this seems extraordinary to me, was largely theosophical.
Okay.
Now, I'm very impressed that theosophy could find its way to the Canadian Midwest in the 1950s. I mean, we're not talking New York or Los Angeles here. But it did. So I grew up with Alan Leo and through my sister, because that's what she was into. Manly Palmer Hall.
Okay.
Something like Esoteric Wisdom of All Ages or something was his great big book. And that sort of approach, sun signs, and then branching out into horoscopic astrology. And that was fine for a long time. But then when I was in my early 20s, I came to England, to London, where I've more or less been ever since. And then at that point, I discovered psychological astrology, what is now called psychological astrology, mainly Jungian, through the works of Liz Green, of course. And I was very taken with that for a long time and practiced something you might call archetypal or psychological astrology. At the same time, there was a parallel movement going on, which was I was starting to feel rather dangerously out of the loop, culturally speaking, if I was only going to be an astrologer. So I decided to try and solve that problem by going back to university, which I dropped out of earlier, but taking astrology with me in order to study it academically as well as practice it personally.
Right.
So then I started to study astrology as a discourse and blah, blah, blah. And then I got into the history of astrology, which eventually resulted in a PhD in a book I made of my PhD called Prophecy and Power, Astrology in Early Modern England. I guess in the 90s, I discovered the work of Geoffrey Cornelius.
Yes.
And on divinatory astrology, his book, The Moment of Astrology, was very influential on me and had a big impact on me. So I think you could say that my understanding basically became divinatory at that point. Partly this was based on disillusionment with the earlier psychological astrology I'd been involved in.
Right.
Because part of the psychological astrology of the day, even the Jungian stuff to some extent, was the belief that ultimately astrology could be pursued as a science. Now, maybe it may be a spiritual science, but a science nonetheless. Well, even despite the best efforts of Herculean efforts of Gokula,
Yes.
that just did not pan out. And when Jeffrey argued that there is actually little to no evidence that there's anything scientific in the modern sense about astrology, I found that quite persuasive. So I was ready to look at it in a new way.
Yes.
And then returning to prophecy and power, I think what I could see now was the practice of astrology, practitioners of astrology, for whom two things are really, really important. One is the tradition through time, informing them of the truth about this or that. And the other is ritual in space or place, rather. The ritual of casting a horoscope, asking certain questions, looking for the answers and so on. So you have, astrology has its own very special and unique tradition and ritual, which is, I think, essentially divinatory. But it's also the astrologers doing these things in the context of a world of huge social and political and cultural forces and movements, which the astrologer has little or no control over.
Yes.
And hardly anybody else does either.
Yes.
So because they're not practicing astrology in a void, nobody can do that. We all live in a world. So my book was partly concerned to look at how the massive changes at this time in history, at this place, in England, the English Civil War, the interregnum, so-called, afterwards, the rule by Cromwell, then the Restoration. These are all really big things. And they had a huge impact on astrology, which basically, in a nutshell, went from being a very influential part of the culture, not just popular culture, but elite as well, in the 1640s and 50s, I'd say. And then suddenly it really, in historical terms, extremely rapidly crashed to the point where it was, if you went to an astrologer, if you were a member of the gentry or the elite, you went to an astrologer, you had to do it secretly now.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting that it does sort of, as you say, coincide with the sort of the rise of science, and you're kind of getting things like the Royal Society, which are kind of coming to the fore, and you get this transition period with natural philosophy where astrology and astronomy seem to kind of coexist for a while together. And then, as you say, that things kind of fall off a cliff. And astrology, particularly once the planet Uranus is discovered, the basis for astrology almost bottoms out, and it does lose its credibility and so on. And Lilly and William Lilly and Ashmole are living at that cuspal time, aren't they?
Well, they are indeed. And of course, it's not like early modern science, 1660s and 70s and 80s, came along and suddenly astrology was banished. But as natural science, the natural scientific model of Bacon, Descartes, Galileo, and slightly later Newton, slowly gathered speed, it started to have more cultural clout. And it started to move away from religion, any dependence on religion, which earlier had been quite explicit, quite open, and that was really harmful in a sense for astrology. It was really difficult for astrology to deal with because it was stranded on the wrong side of the new divide between truth and falsehood, and it was defined as superstition, basically. And it's interesting that after Lilly and Ashmole, the next generation of astrologers, 1680s, for example, onwards, they were horrified by what was happening to astrology, their loss of cultural prestige. And they tended to react in two different ways. They tried to reform astrology. They put all their lives into reforming astrology in two different ways. One movement, the scientific reform, was the effort to prove statistically that astrology worked or was true. So then they thought, well, then it'll be accepted by the scientists and we'll be okay. But that so didn't happen, partly because of the difficulties of actually doing that, which are insurmountable, actually. But partly because even if they had come up with good results, I very much doubt they would have been invited into the club again. for political reasons and cultural reasons. The other reform movement was we shouldn't cooperate with these people. They're our enemies. We need to go back to an astrology that's pure, and we have allowed astrology to become corrupt. So in a sense, they blamed themselves, or they blamed astrologers for what was happening. We're corrupt and decadent. We need to purify astrology. Well, of course, that didn't work either.
Okay. I mean, that's interesting that you say that, because when I was sort of doing research certainly on the recent episode that I did on Ashmole and the Royal Society, it seemed as though the emphasis, even at that point with the Royal Society, was on the more Aristotelian model, and they saw astrology as more with the sort of the Platonic model, and that it wasn't rooted enough in concrete material study of what's down here kind of thing. Yeah, so it's interesting that the astrologers themselves, I mean, I thought it was interesting, for instance, at the end of Lilly's life, that he moved from astrology into what he called physic, their version of medicine.
That's right.
So even he was doing that kind of movement, sort of following the trend almost. Which it's strange, because I mean, I know during the course, as sort of diviners feeling a little bit under siege by the scientific materialist movement, we tended to be very critical of that sort of scientific materialism. But you can identify with the desire to sort of ground astrology, in not just have it being up there as part of religion, but to ground it in actual experience and in what's going on down here on Earth. But
that's all good. That's all good, but it won't establish the scientific status of astrology.
No.
Because it will remain as what the scientific researchers and philosophers of science scornfully call anecdotal.
Yes, and because it doesn't follow the rules of science. It doesn't follow the sort of cause-effect model, does it?
No, not the cause-effect model. And this is the new science that came along that replaced the old Aristotelian science, which for hundreds of centuries prior to the early 17th century was the model of science, which basically just meant a disciplined inquiry into the causes and effects of the sublunary world.
Yes.
Well, that didn't really work anymore.
Yes.
So now you have people like Jeff Dean, Dr. No of modern astrology, doing what he calls research. And he actually says, and has stuck by saying, if you want to evaluate astrology scientifically, you have to get rid of the astrologer.
Yes, and that, I mean, the astrology is really the key, isn't it?
Whereas in fact, getting rid of the astrology, the astrologer, there's no astrology left. Perhaps there's something like natural philosophy. Perhaps there's planetary effects along the lines of the lunar tides, and et cetera, models like that. But there's no horoscopic astrology. It simply cannot be encompassed in that perspective.
Okay, so I suppose at this point, it's maybe worth going back to Lilly and talking a little bit about Jeffrey's work around Lilly and teasing out Lilly's view on astrology as of being more divinatory.
Yes, I mean, the Company of Astrologers kind of claimed Lilly as a divinatory astrologer, but I think with some reason. I think they were actually justified in doing that. If you actually look into his practice, he was asking questions of the cosmos through the chart. Everything he did was participatory.
Yes.
Therefore, the quality of the astrologer, is he a good person? Is he an ethical person? Is he a wise person, etc.? This had an impact on the astrological judgment.
Yes.
So it's not just totally so-called objective. There's an inalienable subjective component as well, and put the two together, you have the practice of astrology.
Yes, I mean, when I was sort of doing the episode on Lilly last week, I was really struck by the fact that, for instance, when he was studying with John Evans, he got very upset that John Evans lied to a client in order to sort of please her about the facts of the chart, and he found that abhorrent. It sort of went against his ethics. And then also later, when he was kind of pandering to the parliamentarians and then changing sides almost, he's quite sort of adamant that no, he was being true to his art, that he had to tell the truth of what he saw in the chart. It wasn't a case of taking sides. It was a case of being true to, what he saw at that time in the art sort of thing.
Yeah, it's a tricky issue because he was a very shrewd man. He knew how to protect himself and how to move with the times. In a vulgar expression, he knew how to cover his ass. And so, but I think what would happen was if he could find an astrological judgment that favored his side, that was indicated an outcome that he would be in favor of, if he could justify it astrologically, then he was happy to proceed with that.
But I mean, he wouldn't.
Now, the skeptic says, well, you can justify anything astrologically, but that's not true.
No, it's not true. There are rules.
There are rules.
Yeah, and he's quite a stickler for the rules.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, having said that, he was also sort of accused of, for example, with conjunction theory, sort of making up his own techniques where he sort of went from the great conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn to then moving to conjunctions between Saturn and Mars. So he went off a little bit and riffed on his own. I suppose what Jeffrey would argue there was he's still being true to the rules. He's not saying he's not sort of saying that a conjunction with a say a malefic is a good thing, but he's also doing whatever it takes to get him into that place where he is able to access those states of consciousness, the intuition that's allowing him to do the divination.
No, that's right.
So perhaps you could just explain for non-practitioners and those who are maybe not necessarily that familiar with the history of science, what natural philosophy is.
Well, natural philosophy was the name at the time for what we would now call science, but it didn't have that name until the 1800s. And it was a combination of Francis Bacon's ideas, Galileo's ideas, and Descartes' ideas. So it's quite complex. But the person who kind of fused those ideas into one discourse was Isaac Newton. And Newton actually, was deeply versed in occultism and perennial philosophy. Spent far more time on biblical interpretation than he ever did on the practice of science. Deeply studied alchemy. But he instituted an interesting new rule. So I think it's fair to say that a very crucial idea that he got from astrology was the idea of action at a distance with no intermediaries.
Oh, interesting.
And of course that would be an old astrological idea in the sense of astrological influences, okay, from the planet.
Yes, and sort of ray theory and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's right. And he said, in effect, Newton said, well, this is actually, and he got in a lot of trouble. He had a lot of criticism for that idea. They said it's mystical. You don't know how the action's happening. But in terms of forming a theory of gravity, he said, well, basically, no, we don't know what gravity is, but we know what effects it has. And those effects are measurable and quantitative. So as long as the effect of the occult force is measurable and quantitative, it's okay. But if it's not, then it isn't okay, and we have to get rid of it. So astrology was left with this sort of poison chalice. Either you prove your validity quantitatively, or bye-bye, shown the door. And so astrologers, in a sense, have ever since then been trying to do that. They have never succeeded, and in my humble opinion, never will.
Yes, I agree with you. So in that sense, do you think that is why astrology kind of moved into the realm of psychology?
Well, yes, because astrology is a bit like William Lilly. It's an old fox. It's very good at surviving. And of course, when Jung came along, I mean, Dane Rudhyar was the first to realize this. What an opportunity to take a new form, for astrology to take a new cultural form in terms of the unconscious and archetypes. Well, planetary archetypes. So this was our opportunity to find a new niche and flourish within the limits of that niche.
Yes, and I must say, going back and looking at the work of Jung, which I did quite a lot last year, I was also struck by how much his ideas and theories were actually influenced by esoteric theories and ideas.
Oh, massively.
It's almost like he's taking the concepts of the esoteric and the perennial philosophy, and he's giving it a new language.
Yeah. Well, he was essentially a Platonist, but instead of, or a Neoplatonist in terms of the one with a capital O, or a Platonist in the sense of God or the unmoved mover, although that was Aristotle's phrase, but being in a perfect heaven, unlike the sublunary world below the moon down here, which is always changing and so on. But what Jung did was he took the God or the one from up there and put it in the basement.
Mm-hmm.
He put it in the unconscious, down.
Yes.
Not up, but down, in the dark, not in the light, but in the dark. Now, in a way, that's a very powerful move to make. But in another way, it isn't radical because it doesn't change the fact that you're starting with an essence of some kind. In his case, the self, very much with a capital S.
Yes.
And everything's supposed to follow from that.
Mm-hmm.
But when I became a divinatory astrologer, or studied divination, among other intellectual changes of mine at the time, I really was led to question that, because what I kept coming up was that we live in a world of relations and relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And relations and relationships are prior to anything else. So archetypes are not fundamental in this view. Archetypes are an outcome of certain relationships over time. And that includes the self. You don't start with one, the self or God or man or nature with a capital N. You start with at least two or more and the relationship between them.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Patrick. In the sense that I suppose I've also had an evolving relationship with this, as have many astrologers, where the sort of modernist project of psychological astrology and of archetypal astrology, it does try to create these sort of abstract, almost like the Platonic forms, where you have these sort of symbols that are supposed to be universal and finite. And I guess, as you're saying, what happens then is you end up finding that, first of all, you can't make universalist statements about everybody's experience. They don't all fit in these neat little categories.
That's right, exactly.
And also that psychology itself tends to internalize everything. So it becomes extremely sort of egotistical, and you forget the world out there and the fact that astrology was once part of a cosmology. And it does, you become very split. I mean, was that what you mean by?
Yeah, well, the problem with psychological astrology, in fact, the problem with psychology at all, is that it's Cartesian.
Yes.
Essentially, at root, it's Cartesian. And why do I say that? Because Descartes radically, violently split everything into spirit and matter, or what he called thinking stuff and extended stuff.
Right.
And the point is that that's not how we live.
No.
We live in both worlds. We live as we are both subjects, agents, we hurt, we originate things, etc., and objects. Things can be done to us because we're embodied. And that's how life works, okay? There's a nice quote from Wittgenstein somewhere. It says something like, physiology is, of course, not life, and neither is psychology. Life is the world.
Yes.
Okay? So the problem from my point of view is that psychology accepted the Cartesian split and said, okay, well, let the scientific bods, the men in white coats, have the physical world. We're going to run with the psychological world, with psychology. The mind is just a kind of stand-in for spirit, basically, and spiritual.
Yes.
So it doesn't alarm. People get alarmed when they hear the word spiritual, so they want to secularize it as mental, and then they think, oh, mental, okay, that's okay, I can handle that.
That's what I meant by Jung and his language, that he almost made it more comfortable to sort of talk about.
Oh, yes, absolutely, safely secularized. This awful term, I really have grown to hate it, synchronicity.
Yes.
Isn't that reassuring, that word? Things like, oh, synchronicity must be something we understand. Yeah, that's all sorted already. No, it isn't. You don't understand it. And every time it happens, you don't understand it all over again. So I don't use the word synchronicity at all anymore. I would prefer to speak, if I have to, of something like resonance or resonances. But Jung did a lot of that. So that's a big problem with all psychology, is that it's only got it's a half truth. It's a partial truth. The other problem is with the archetype of the self, say, or the one. How do you know that the one is the one?
And also, you can only necessarily have your experience of the one, and which isn't necessarily going to be the experience of other people.
That's right. That's right. And as Christianity and Islam both have demonstrated in their histories, if you're going to assert a universal truth that is true everywhere, always, for everyone, with no exceptions allowed, the truth of, say, God with a capital G, then you end up with violence.
Yes.
You know? So let's not go there. Let's not go there.
Which segues into another sort of theme, which was apocalypticism. And I mean, we're sort of seeing refrains of that now again, where, for example, the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn at that time was seen as sort of almost like a sign of the second coming.
Very much so, yeah.
And this kind of put people into a very strange frame of mind, where they did start to become quite, things did become very divisive and polarized, and exactly what you're saying, in much the same way as now, where we sort of having what Naomi Klein has called the Armageddon complex, where she sort of said in a recent article, to bet against the future on this scale, to bank on your bunker, is to betray at the most basic level our duties to one another, to the children we love, to every other life form with whom we share a planetary home. This is a belief system that is genocidal at its core and treasonous to the wonder and beauty of this world. And I'm wondering how much of this...
So apocalypticism, I'm temperamentally completely averse to it. With all due respect to teenagers, it's incredibly melodramatic and satisfying in that sort of way, but it's not a mature, complex, or humane way to look at the world. And but it's always been around. It was hugely around in the 17th century, and now it's making a comeback, worryingly, at very high circles, like J.D. Vance, for example.
Yes, it is.
Gosh, I don't know how to deal with it, really. I think, divide and conquer is not a good way to live.
Yes, exactly. No. And so to that, I mean, I know that you got into Buddhism at some point. Was it sort of at this time when you were sort of having this shift, or had it happened before?
I got into Buddhism at quite a young age, and 21 to be precise. No, 19.
Okay.
I wouldn't describe myself as a Buddhist, because, or at least that's not all I am, for sure. To some extent, I'm an animist, and so forth and so on. But on the other hand, I also, have had a lot to do with Buddhism over the years. So I would say now I've had a long relationship with Buddhism. And one of the attractions of it for me was that there was no concept of God.
Yes.
I experienced that as a huge relief.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that. I mean, do you think it's unfair to make a comparison between that and, for example, the early scientists who were feeling completely suffocated by the church and by this sort of very heavy doctrine of that you had to follow, otherwise you were a heretic, and wanting to be free to actually sort of study things in their own way, sort of without the dictates of that sort of overbearing kind of religion?
Oh yeah. Also, by the way, we're inclined, I think, we moderns are inclined to think of the church practices and behavior as solely as a power trip, and perhaps even a cynical power trip. There's a remarkable book, a novel called Zeno of Bruges, by Marguerite Yourcenar, in which you read this book, and halfway through you suddenly realize, when, for example, the Inquisition says, if you don't recant, we'll have to burn you at the stake for your own good. Your inclination, your immediate reaction is, yeah, right. But actually, you start to realize they mean it.
Yes.
They meant it.
Yes.
They were perfectly sincere, which is even more scary.
Yes.
So I think you're right about the scientists and the humanists were looking for, using the word humanist loosely, they were looking for a way to come out from under that influence, which was absolutely massive in a way that we forget very easily.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
but the irony is what happened with early modern science, first natural philosophy and then later science, was that they ended up replicating so much of Christian discourse because instead of God being the universal, one single universal truth, and I say single because if it's universal, there can only be one truth, one God, one way.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Why? Because if there's another one, then it's not universal, is it? If there's some corner of the cosmos where the Christianity doesn't apply, then it's not universal. That's unacceptable.
Yeah, exactly.
So what the scientists ended up doing was replacing God as the universal truth with truth with
Yes.
a capital T, secular scientific truth as universally true. This scientific truth has to be universally true. Gravity has to work everywhere, or it's sorry, it's not good enough. And there can't be another kind of gravity. There only can be the one kind of gravity.
Yes.
And so they ended up replicating that in authoritarianism that is inherent in any assertion of one truth.
Yes.
And that's most unfortunate, let's say.
Well, yes, and particularly for astrology, which just, I mean, it couldn't, it couldn't deal with it.
No, astrology is multiple.
Yes.
No, because astrology is multiple truths, and it's inherently
Yes.
multiple because there's more than one
Yes.
planet. You can't reduce everything to the sun, even the sun. It doesn't work. So there's poor old astrology is like just over a barrel here.
Yes, and then they kept discovering new planets, and it was kind of like, oh my God, and how do we sort of, how do we deal with this from a philosophical point of view? Because the system was so nice and neat, wasn't it? Like up to Saturn.
Oh, yeah. It was lovely.
Every other planet had two signs. It was all nice and sort of symmetrical, and
Oh, I know. I miss it.
yeah, and then chaos sort of broke loose. But I mean, in that chaos does come sort of fresh, I suppose, what you would say, sort of evolution. And in this sense, so you went from psychological astrology to divinatory astrology, and then what happened from there?
The only thing that's happened that since then of any interest is, I think, this is a very personal point of view, is a PhD thesis by James Brockbank, who you may know, also from Kent.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, there's a lot of this divinatory material on a website called Cosmocritics that I run with Kirk Little and Gary Phillipson.
Well, I'll put a link in the show notes so if people want to investigate that a little bit further.
Yeah, Cosmocritics. And one of the things on Cosmocritics is James's PhD thesis. And James has what I would call a naturally philosophical mind. And and he showed very clearly in philosophical terms, and I think personally convincingly, that if you want to understand how astrological truth is possible, and that experience we've all had,
Yes.
doesn't happen every day, of course.
No, it doesn't.
Of an astrological interpretation being astonishingly accurate down to the last detail,
Yes.
true.
Yes.
Well, if you want to understand how that's possible, all you need are an astrological tradition, okay, of knowledge. It doesn't, in a sense, matter which one, as long as it's sufficiently rich and detailed. Secondly, you need an astrologer.
Yes.
Thirdly, you need somebody asking a question of the chart. The chart is just like a massive, overwhelmingly amount of data and
information. Yes.
Too much information,
Yes.
which is completely useless unless you have a question that you're trying to figure out the answer for, right?
It's true. Exactly, because it organizes sort of what you're looking for symbolically, and and it reduces sort of like, as you say, the overwhelm otherwise.
Oh, yeah. So the querent, or the person asking the question, can be the astrologer themselves, of course. And then the last thing that you need, that is indispensable, is what James calls a responsive cosmos.
Yes, and here we get into the really sort of important
Now,
part.
this was even difficult for Geoffrey and the divinatory people, the company people, because, but I don't think it's unfair to say that they really didn't want to let go of Neoplatonic entities. And the Yogians don't want to let go of archetypes. And James just came along and said, well, that's great. If you want to do that, that's fine. But if they're not necessary, you don't actually need them.
Yes, and I mean,
In this sense, James's thesis was extremely Protestant. He got rid of everything he could that wasn't necessary. And the only thing he's left with, the main thing he's left with, is a responsive cosmos, a cosmos that is willing, apparently, to consider your question and answer it.
give you an answer.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I
yes.
think that's really the truth as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, and I think, well, a couple of things. I mean, when you were saying about not wanting to let go of archetypes, I want to sort of come back to that and talk about language and metaphor. But also, yes, you have to have a conscious cosmos, in order for that process to kind of work. Because as you say, it's not just the astrologer, but the astrologer's asking a question of what, of who.
Well, yeah, and there's no shame in saying you can't go further than that. There's no shame if somebody comes along and says, "Well, that's ridiculous. How does a responsive cosmos work? Where does it come from? What are its characteristics, etc." You're in a situation which Wittgenstein described as you're digging and you hit rock. Well, that's bedrock. You can't go down any further, and there's no disgrace in it.
Yes.
That's just how it is.
Yes, but as you say, in the modern world, it is very difficult to accept that.
Yes, it is.
I mean, I remember struggling when we started doing the course with when Angela started doing the stuff about statues and sort of theurgy. I thought, I can't start talking about worshipping statues and sort of gods in statues. This is a step too far.
I know what you mean.
It's very difficult to sort of to comprehend that you're dealing with something that's quite primitive, and primeval. As you say, it's bedrock. You have to have a conscious, animated cosmos in order for the astrology to work. It's not sort of planets sending down beams, that you can measure.
It really, really isn't about that. I mean, one little thing that helped me was the concept of animism, and
yes.
and in living in a world of relationships including many with non-humans.
Yes.
Okay, and not just other animals, but all kinds of creatures. And another thing that helped was the realization I had that historically speaking, when Descartes comes along and says, there is nothing that should cause any wonder in the world. There are no mysteries.
Oh my goodness. I mean, that's terrifying.
And Galileo said basically the same thing, only Galileo said there's a primary world which causes everything else. And the primary world consists of just forces and atoms in motion and so on. This causes the merely phenomenal, sensual, secondary world of colors and sounds and qualities and changes, but they're not real.
Yes, and the cosmos is just a machine.
Yeah, well, these statements, do you think they're scientific observations? They're not scientific. There's nothing scientific about them. They're far too sweeping. They could never be tested, okay? Or falsified.
Yes, which is an irony.
So, well, it is an irony, yes, not to say completely hypocritical.
Isn't it, considering?
But what they are, in fact, the statements like Galileo's or Descartes are interventions to make us see the world that way.
Yes.
They're rhetorical interventions.
And there are beliefs.
Oh, yes, absolutely. That's right. Absolutely.
Which is very unscientific.
Yeah. Anyway, there we are.
So coming back to this idea of archetypes and language, I was very interested in the fact that you, at some point in your career, you moved on to being very interested in metaphor and language. And I'm very interested to get into that a little bit more and sort of try to sort of tease out this idea, because I think one of the other core tenets of astrology or any form of divination is that it's got a language.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of essential for creating the tradition and also for understanding what, for example, a symbol means in that tradition, as opposed to what that symbol might mean outside of that tradition. and also of relating. That you need some kind of language in order to relate.
Well, the thing about one of the things that's peculiar about languages and metaphor in particular is it partly discovers something. The classic form of a metaphor is X is Y. Okay, it's the is. And Wittgenstein says we never see anything as it is. We see it as something.
Yes.
And we don't see it in itself. We see it as something. So the is of X is Y means a metaphor is at work.
Okay.
Now, in that process, so let's see, think of an astrological application. Boxing match is an instance of Mars, the principle of Mars at work. So what you know about Mars, if you're an astrologer, enables you to understand something essential about the boxing match that perhaps you're watching. Okay, so it's revealed something, a deeper truth about what you're seeing. But it also partly creates what you're seeing, because we know that Mars is violence. It's a male planet. It's if not violent, then it's vigorous, dynamic male energy. So it's shaping what you're seeing as well. So the thing about metaphor is it both reveals the truth and creates the truth at the same time, both. Well, you can imagine what the scientists think of that.
Yes.
They don't. They just accept this is a paradox. We can't have a paradox be true.
Yes, I mean, it comes back to that, the famous experiment, doesn't it? Where, is something a particle or a wave? And what is it, Heisenberg? It depends very much on the perception of the person.
Oh, well, it does, yeah. Yeah, but the scientists themselves found lots of ingenious ways not to let that affect anything outside the micro world of physics. So if you said, oh, well, it's indeterminacy, we can't decide, I can't decide, they said, no, there's no indeterminacy in the world we actually live in. It's only in the micro world of physics, not the macro world. So that's a move, or another rhetorical move, to contain the implications of quantum physics. And then people ignore that, which of course they're entitled to.
Yes, but of course the problem with astrology, you can't do that, because the practice of astrology itself, never mind the theory or the sort of the philosophy of astrology, is rooted in everyday life. I mean, you want to know a question about something that's directly involves a particular person at a particular place or time, and you are looking to sort of impact or talk about this world, not just the sort of world up there.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lifelong practice with the I Ching, divinatory practice with the I Ching.
And yes, me too.
It's interesting and often amusing how it completely transcends this distinction we have drilled into us culturally between the high and the low, or the pure and the impure, or the important spiritual truths and the grubby down here practical truth. It just answers your question regardless of what it is, and doesn't make any. What I'm trying to say is that the high stuff is all implicit in the low stuff.
Yes.
If you ask a horary question, which is like, I've mislaid my pocket watch, where is it? That's a typical kind of horary question. What you are expecting, and not without reason, oddly enough, is for the entire cosmos, certainly the visible cosmos, to answer your question and tell you where your pocket watch is.
Yes.
If your attitude is sufficiently respectful and humble, even perhaps reverential,
yes,
I think you stand a good chance of getting the answer. Of course, you don't necessarily get the answer because there's nothing necessary about astrology. If there was, we would control it. In which case, we wouldn't be able to learn anything new because we'd only be getting back what we put into it, which is the problem with AI, incidentally.
Oh, yes. But I mean, even this, I find it quite sort of crazy too, because it goes back to what you were saying about science and belief, that people keep anthropomorphizing AI, and it's not alive, it's not conscious.
I know.
It's crazy. It says something about us as human beings, doesn't it? And our innate attitude, which is not necessarily a wrong attitude, that we want to have this relationship with a conscious cosmos.
Yeah. That's the animism thing. Yeah, yeah. But then there's sometimes a time in keeping with Lilly's fox-like wisdom. There's a time for strategic disenchantment, for strategic de-animism,
Yes,
for
yes,
saying this appears to be a person, but is it really?
yeah,
There's no rules that always work in this game.
yes. Well, I mean, there needs to be discernment.
Exactly.
That's where I think Lilly was really interesting, was that he had this really strong sense of discernment. Looking at his chart, I kind of thought, gosh, this is his Mars in Virgo, where he was sort of very clear about what he felt was ethically right and what wasn't, but also about if he felt that people were doing astrology not wrong, but that they were sort of taking liberties, not following the rules of astrology, that he would get quite angry and irritated and lose respect for that person. I found it quite amusing, actually, going over his diaries and that sort of thing. But so it's both of those things. I keep thinking of Jeffrey and Cardano.
That's right.
There's a technique, there's a tradition and rules that you have to follow. You can't just do anything. Otherwise it wouldn't be astrology. And then at the same time, there's also this more pliant art of interpretation and where the sort of the intuition comes in.
Well, the thing about rules is, suppose you have a set of rules of telling you how to do something or what to do, right? Mm-hmm. But then arise questions about how, when, and where to apply these rules. You'll need another set of rules telling you how to apply the applications and so on. It's called an infinite regress. And that's why there will always, always need to be art.
Right.
There's always, it requires, you cannot get away without art. And if you eliminate the art, like Jeff Dean is trying to do, of the art of astrology, you'll be left with nothing.
But also just a very soulless and dry experience.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So I guess going back to your journey, how did the leap happen from astrology to, first of all, Tolkien and also ecocentrism?
Well, if I look at my interests, which are basically astrology, Tolkien, ecocentrism, and enchantment, my last two books have been on the subject of enchantment, that is the experience of wonder. Mm-hmm. I just don't know. There's no obvious common thread, but there are some subtle ones. And one of them is, these are all human experiences, and I'm very interested in the human. I realized a few years ago and this is somebody who's massively influenced by the 60s and grew up in the 60s. I realized with something of a shock that I was no longer interested in achieving enlightenment or leading a spiritual life. I'm interested in leading a human life. I'm interested in being the best possible human being that I possibly can. Okay? Mm-hmm. And if being spiritual is part of that, fine. But if it's not, that's fine too.
Okay. And also, I guess there's the art part, because Tolkien himself is, he's a writer and he's creating this whole world that, it is art, it's metaphor, it's all these things that are kind of opening this up.
Well, once you prioritize the human, you start to notice things, including what I call voices of sanity, that are hard to hear in the noise and the tumult and the exaggerations and the sheer lies that we're flooded with every day, not just on the internet, but, in various forms, and pack out the news.
Yes.
And these voices of sanity are usually pretty quiet, but you can hear them if you try to. Tolkien was one of those voices. Another one is Montaigne. Once I became sensitized to this human orientation, I started to become more interested and more concerned with these voices. And so enchantment for me is the experience of wonder that is inherent to being an embodied, embedded ecological being, human being in the world, not an Ubermensch, not a super being of any kind, Platonic, Nietzschean, or any other kind.
Yes.
We know where that leads us. We've already been there in the Second World War, and I hope we're not going back there. And I found that The Lord of the Rings was an incredibly sane text in this context.
Yes, I mean, all those themes are there. I mean, you can see the big brother of kind of big tech and surveillance capitalism as sort of Sauron.
Absolutely.
And, the way that they sort of cut down all the trees and was sort of,
Yeah.
Mordor is this absolutely sort of dead place.
Well, Mordor is the only modern nation state in Middle Earth.
Interesting.
It's got a very aggressive foreign policy. It's got a massive military industrial complex. It's got a slave-based economy. It uses surveillance. It's completely modern. It's the only one. So it's like Tolkien was saying, well, if you carry on, you're going to end up living in Mordor.
Yes. I mean, this is where I was so struck by the work of Tom Cheetham, that he really sort of teases this out, in his book, his sort of definitive book on this Green Man, Earth Angel. And I guess this is where we can maybe segue into ecocentrism and ethics.
Yeah.
Because I think that, this is something that if you are kind of a libertarian, and you believe in sort of absolute freedom, which, I mean, we are seeing a lot of in certain parts of, say, for America, for example, it means you don't feel that you have to have ethics or sort of limits on what you do, or that what you do should not be constrained in any way by other people or society, or your obligations, say, to the planet, or anything. I mean, I'm interested in how you kind of got to that place, because I was really struck by your statement that you did on your Ecological Citizen YouTube channel, where you talk about ethics. And that's that's the one thing that's so absent at the moment. And I love the way you put it in terms of, if you are in relation to something, there are obligations, there are, the ethics immediately comes into it. So I just wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit, to that.
Sure. Well, the word ecology, and the study ecology, the scientific study, is the study of relationships between individual animals and beings and communities of animals. Okay? Ecology is the study of relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Ecocentrism means you putting relationships not restricted to human beings, because that's anthropocentrism. You're putting relationships with all kinds of beings at the center of your life.
Mm-hmm.
And as human beings, we have the unique privilege, or the curse, of consciously realizing that in any relationship that you're in, you are having an effect on the other party.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it's not a real relationship. If person A is affecting person B, but not the other way around as well, it's not a relationship.
Yes.
It's just pure, say, dominance, master-slave, or whatever you want to call it, but it's not a relationship. Well, if you're having an effect on the other, whoever the other is,
yes,
then you are responsible for that effect.
Yes.
You have to take responsibility for that effect.
Mm-hmm.
In which case the principle becomes, in the words of one of my fellow editors at the Ecological Citizen, do least harm.
Yes.
Do the least harm you can. You're not going to be perfect. You're not going to do probably no harm. That's not realistic. But ethics, in this frame of mind, in this worldview, ethics are, for us humans, are present from the very start of life, from the very get-go, both collective life and individual life. Okay? From the point of view, the relational point of view that I'm talking about, which is inherent in ecology and therefore ecocentrism, relationships, there's nothing more important than ethics from the get-go. They're present. Can't avoid them.
And this is true of astrology too, in the sense that if you're reading for somebody, you do have an obligation to be, all the things that Lilly talked about at the beginning of Christian astrology, to be honest, to be ethical, to do, as you say, the least harm, because, potentially, this is where, I think Prophecy and Power is really interesting, is that these astrologers were making huge pronouncements about things that they did often have huge consequences too, about who was going to win a battle, who wouldn't, and Lilly advising the king on which direction he should escape to, which in turn, and then of course the king didn't listen to him. He ended up on the island where he went south instead of east, and so he got caught.
I know.
But that had enormous implications.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's right.
Yes, it's definitely, it's something that tends to get skipped over these days, I think.
Well, I think again, we moderns would think, oh, Lilly advising the king, how cynical of him, because he was an anti-royalist. But actually, no, Lilly was just going, look, The king asked for my help. King's another human being.
Yes.
I'll help him if I can
Yes.
on that basis. Nothing cynical about that.
No, and I mean he does say it sort of in his memoirs. It wasn't that he wasn't fond of the king. It was the system that he didn't sort of agree with.
That's right. Yeah.
And then later sort of got disillusioned with the parliamentarians because they turned out to be sort of just as self-serving and not really interested in helping the people either.
Yeah. But his real enemy, of course, were the Presbyterians.
Yes, I mean he seemed to loathe them. I mean, what was going on there?
Well, the Presbyterians totally into predestination. Okay.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh God, yes, that was their thing. Like your name is already marked up in the great book in the sky, and there's nothing you can do about it. You're either damned or you're saved. So in a way, there was a kind of competition in a weird sort of way with astrology there, between the view that fate is written in the stars. Your fate is written in the stars. Only the Presbyterians would say, no, it's written in God's book. So they were competing for two different kinds of something that I wouldn't want to have either of.
Yes, it's who's got authority in that sense. Who's got final authority?
Exactly. Who's got the authority? That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And astrology. To come back to astrology for a moment, I realized that astrology is a human experience in relationship with the divine. Hence, divination. That's what the word means.
Could you sort of unpack that a little bit for people that maybe aren't familiar with Jeffrey's sort of thesis and with this idea of astrology as divination?
Well, yes. Astrologers are faced with the challenge of coming out from under some very unhelpful influences and ideas. One of them is that astrology is scientific. Secondly, related idea is that the stars are doing things to us.
Yes.
They're not. They're just doing what they do. So I have retrained myself now in a way. Suppose somebody said, oh, Fred has a really bad temper. He's a bad-tempered guy. And an astrologer who hasn't got out from under these influences would probably say, well, that's because he has an afflicted Mars. Well, I've retrained myself never to do that, not to do that anymore.
Yes, because essentially otherwise what you're saying is Mars caused him to have a bad temper.
Exactly, which is not the case. Not the case.
And it also removes personal responsibility.
Good point. That's right. So divination, there's certain questions you're allowed to ask in divination, certain you're not. The main one, there's two main questions you can ask in divination, by which I mean ask the divine, or however you want to conceptualize it, for an answer to two kinds of questions. One is, what should my attitude be now? And this is even if you're asking with in mind a future event. You don't say, will this future event happen? Will I marry this person? Will I get this job?
Yes, because
nobody can answer that, because the future is rooted in the present, and the present is changing all the goddamn time. So you don't ask that question. All you do is you say, what should my attitude be now, at the moment I'm asking the question, to this hypothetical event in the future?
Yes.
And the second kind of question you can ask is, what am I missing?
Yes.
What am I not seeing about the situation? Tell me. Give me an insight, please. Okay? And that's fine, but you don't ask future questions, and you don't ask about, you can ask about causes and if you want to, but don't take them literally.
Yes, because then you get into questions of fate, and sort of, I guess everyone has to make their own, come to their own decisions about how fate figures into astrology.
Well, Jeffrey famously said, destiny, that means, in other words, fate, is negotiable.
Yes. That's sort of huge, but that's a huge and subversive statement.
Yes, it is huge, and it's a bit of an exaggeration too, I think, because I believe in relation to fate, you do have choices, but the choice, the deck of cards is stacked by fate that you're making on the basis of which you're making choices. So within the hand, you've got the freedom to deal with the hand that you've been dealt, however you want, but you have no control over that hand. It's fate that gives you that hand.
Yes, and yeah, I agree with you. Even if you were to sort of go back to Platonic philosophy and the idea that your soul chooses particular sort of events that you're going to experience in your life. Even that, to an extent, is about choice, but it's a choice that you've made before you've incarnated, if that's what your beliefs are.
Exactly. That's right. That's right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then within
Yeah.
that, you obviously you come in, you don't remember, so you've therefore got freedom of choice to make different decisions. Or yeah. But yeah,
I mean, freedom is real, but it's constrained. In fact, maybe that's what makes it real, is that it's constrained. Absolute freedom is a complete fantasy and nonsense. It's impossible.
But another thing that you talk about in the book is you contrast Lilly and Ashmole as being sort of almost metaphors of elite versus democratic types of divination. I mean, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that, because I think it goes into the idea of plurality, that astrology is not just one thing.
Yeah, I mean, Ashmole and Lilly did represent two different approaches to astrology. One is more democratic. Well, Lilly's was more democratic or demotic. It was part of the, I would say, largely Protestant, but also to some extent, of course, humanist, as you say, push for making knowledge available to the people so that they would be able to arrive at their own informed decisions,
Yes,
medically, politically, whatever, culturally, without having to depend on a religious elite, starting with the Pope and going down to bishops, to tell them what was what.
Yes.
Okay. And there was a big push on in that direction in the mid 17th century in Britain. And Lilly was part of that. So Culpeper translated the Pharmacopoeia from Latin into English so people could read it, because most people couldn't read Latin, of course. Yeah. So that was going on. Whereas Ashmole's astrology was more part of his general occult philosophy, or esoteric, let's say, philosophy, which goes back to the principle of self-development, magical systems as self-development.
The whole kind of initiatory kind of trajectory.
See, the thing about Tolkien made a terribly important point that nearly everybody's completely ignored, which is that he said magic and enchantment are two very, very different things.
Yes.
Enchantment is just the experience of wonder. You know, you stopped in your tracks, your mouth falls open, you're in this state of wonder, okay? Magic is about controlling and making something happen and making people do things. Now, a lot of magicians, ever since early modern days, applied it to themselves instead of trying to make other people do things. I'm sure Crowley was doing that all the time, trying to make people fall in love with him or give him money or whatever, using magic. But these other people started to use magic in that sense for their self-development, okay? But notice that it's still a matter of power.
Yes, and I mean, it's huge. I mean, obviously not, yes. I mean,
It's
maybe
power over yourself. It's development of yourself. This has nothing to do with the moment of astrology, which is a moment of wonder. They're just two different things. And so Lilly and Ashmole embody that contrast very nicely.
Yes, that sort of Ashmole was almost using it as a means to an end, like to sort of win influence with others, and to sort of get ahead in society. I mean, I read an article by Robert Lomas, who was saying that he thought that Ashmole had become a Freemason for that reason.
I'm sure that's correct.
You know, that he wasn't necessarily that interested in sort of brotherly love and, you know, all the kind of principles that Freemasonry taught, but was more interested in sort of getting ahead using that, you know, the handshake and the sort of, you know, getting into inner circles and things that maybe he wouldn't have otherwise. Whereas Lilly, I mean, even towards the end of his life, you know, Ashmole talks about how he would sort of practice medicine and give advice free to people who couldn't afford to pay for his sort of services and that kind of thing.
Used to do that. Yeah.
So,
what you said about Ashmole reminded me of the title of a book by an English literary critic I'm fond of called D.J. Enright. The title of the book was "Some Men Are My Brothers."
Yes, interesting. Yes.
Not
Yeah, I
all.
mean, you made that point quite strongly, that he was quite elitist.
Oh, I think he was.
But then at the same time, I mean, I was sort of quite interesting that towards the end, Lilly, to an extent, almost came to agree with Ashmole in the sense that he didn't think that certain kinds of knowledge were for everybody. And maybe it was because he had so much heat and criticism for, his public prognostications, and had almost, been thrown in prison for his prediction about the
Oh,
Great Fire
yes,
of
yes,
London and that
yes,
kind of
that's
thing.
right. That's right.
That he also sort of had second thoughts about, should this kind of, is this knowledge sometimes a bit dangerous?
Well, that could be true. I mean, I like to think that Lilly, knew that true esotericism is the truly secret things are secret, not because anybody's keeping them secret, but because we don't see them. They're out there, but we don't see them. And that's the real esoteric or hidden. Esoteric just means hidden.
Yeah. So, Patrick, I was quite interested, what you were saying about modernist policing, of experiences.
Yes, I was thinking of self-policing as the process in which we are encouraged to engage. If you have an animist experience, like, say, that tree just told me something, but it communicated something to me, we are trained and encouraged to think, well, now hang on, it's just a tree. A tree can't do anything, can't tell me anything. So I must have imagined it, or I must have projected the message onto the tree, and all this, pardon me, crap. Who does it benefit? It does not benefit anybody or anything, including or especially the person who engages in it. So I encourage people to not engage in modernist self-policing. And if an encounter, because enchantment's also relational, it always takes the form of an encounter where you're
Mm-hmm.
not in charge, so it's wild, and therefore what Tolkien called perilous. Yes, it is.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have one of these, take it as what it seems to be, which is that you're there to learn something. You're there to have it. This is a new experience in which the cosmos is trying to tell you something. So, for God's sake, if it's gone to all that trouble, listen. Okay? That's what I mean by modernist self-policing. And what do I mean by modernism? Well, the most important definition of modernity that I know of by an ecofeminist philosopher called Val Plumwood is that she said the project of modernity is the rational mastery of nature, including human nature. Okay, so it's all about mastery, which is what we're seeing with Silicon Valley, and
Yes.
we've seen it all along in various. It just takes different forms, and it's inherently violent and destructive. So
Yes, and disenchanting.
totally about disenchantment. It doesn't want enchanted people, because part of the thing about enchantment is it reveals the worth, the true intrinsic worth, which can't be stated in dollars and pounds, of the enchanting other, whether that's a person or a place or a piece of music or work of art or whatever, even a meal. It can't be quantified and instrumentalized.
Mm-hmm.
Well, modernity doesn't want that. Modernity wants passive consumers who have no awareness of intrinsic value in any context of their lives. So the more disenchantment, the better from that.
Yes, and also, I mean, there's the whole sort of question of depersonalization and dehumanization, and
Yes,
not just of other humans, but of, other beings of nature, and how that then allows people to sort of, it numbs them enough to be able to do these dreadful things that we're seeing.
exactly.
I mean, how else can you
Yeah,
do
exactly.
it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And note, for example, these little things can be very revealing. The use of the word people.
Yes.
I'd say 90% of the use of the word people means human beings. But anybody, to start at perhaps a mundane or trivial level, but it isn't really. Anybody who's ever had a pet,
Yes.
a dog or a cat or whatever that they're close to, is in a relationship with one, knows very well that that animal, non-human animal, is a person,
Yes.
is
Yes.
another person. And in fact, once you start thinking about this, the entire world is full of other persons, non-human persons. Just because they're not human beings does not mean that they're not persons and agents and vulnerable
Yes.
and subjects with agenda. They're trying to live their lives, etc. Well, once you start seeing the world that way, it gets a lot harder to create murder and mayhem and havoc, which is probably why it's discouraged.
Yes, I mean, that's my feeling is, if you can sort of turn something or nature, objectify it and sort of turn it into machines, then it's okay to sort of just use something or to...
Well, that's what I was going to say earlier. You said the statement that I was talking about unscientific statements pretending to be science, like there's no mystery anywhere. And you mentioned the statement, the world is a machine, or the cosmos is a machine.
Yes, yes.
Of course, the funny thing about that is it's a metaphor.
Yes.
You're saying, here's the cosmos, and it is this other thing, which is a machine.
Yes.
But the cosmos isn't anything in that sense, or it's everything, or it's a huge number of things. So the attempt to eliminate metaphor, like classically Jeff Dean and Richard Dawkins and those idiotic people, the attempt to eliminate metaphor from truth means that they're, again, as I said earlier, they're left with nothing, because you can't say anything. You can't say the cosmos is X. Whatever X is, it'll be a metaphorical statement or a metaphorical truth. So the statement that the world is a machine, it's a metaphor. Handle it. So it's not just a matter of language or knowing in the right way. It's a matter of being and how we live and who we are. Metaphor goes right down to the roots.
Yes, and also it goes back to what you were saying about the perceiver. You can't remove the perceiver from what's perceived, in the sense that the way one person perceives a symbol in a situation, even an astrologer, is going to be particular to them, to their life experience, to what their sort of whatever their mood is, or what they've seen in a chart, and it's not necessarily going to be the same the next time they use that symbol. So, I mean,
absolutely. What a horror show that is from a modern scientific point of view.
Yes, but it's what makes astrology so versatile, and why you can use it in so many different situations.
Yeah.
I think, but that's what's so, I think, wonderful about astrology, is that your relationship with it evolves all the time, and as you sort of change and your worldview changes, and you sort of experience different things, so your relationship with it, and that it's able to do that it's so rich.
That's right.
So, without sort of getting too prescriptive, what advice would you have for a young person who's getting into some form of divination now?
It's not all about you. It's not all about your mind. It's not all about your unconscious. And if you're practicing divination of any kind, or indeed if you're just living, you're in a set of relationships. So take them seriously, take the other party seriously, have a little humility, see what you can learn. It's almost that simple.
That's great, Patrick.